Imagine the roar of 1,000 Mongol horsemen, the ground shaking beneath their hooves as they charge across the steppes. The air is thick with the scent of fire and dust, and the distant cry of enemies fills the horizon. Genghis Khan, the most feared warlord in history, surveys his army, ready to conquer the world. But just as he's about to issue his next command, a strange crack rips through the sky. A swirling, blue vortex opens, distorting the very fabric of time and space. Without warning, a lone figure stumbles through the rift and lands in the middle of his war council. Dust settles around him as he gasps for breath. It's Kylian Mbappé, the French footballer, the one known for his lightning speed and deadly accuracy on the soccer field. The Mongols stare at him, baffled. He's dressed in the clothes of a warrior they've never seen, a hoodie emblazoned with a tiger logo, athletic shorts, and cleats designed for running, not for war. His gaze sweeps across the tent, his eyes wide with confusion. One of Genghis Khan's generals steps forward, eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Who are you?" he demands in harsh, guttural Mongol. Mbappé looks around, completely disoriented. I'm Kylian, and I think I've taken a wrong turn." The Mongol War Council falls silent. The name Kylian Mbappé means nothing to them. To them, the world is filled with warriors, kings, and conquerors, not footballers. Genghis Khan himself, ever the strategist, looks at the young man with keen eyes, his thoughts racing. He motions for one of his generals to approach. "Bring him to me," Genghis Khan orders. Mbappé, still trying to make sense of what's happening, is dragged to the center of the tent. His mind races with 1,000 questions, but the only thing he can focus on is the sheer, overwhelming presence of the Mongol emperor himself. Genghis Khan, a legend of ruthless power, sits across from him, his eyes burning with curiosity. "So, you are from the future," Genghis Khan observes, leaning in. "Yeah, about 1,000 years ahead," Mbappé mutters, trying to process the situation. "Look, I'm just a footballer. I don't know how I ended up here." The warlord's face cracks into a grin. "A footballer?" He repeats the word with intrigue. "Interesting. You are fast, yes? I could use someone like you. Do you understand battle tactics?" Mbappé hesitates. "I mean, I understand strategy, yeah. But more like, how to win on a soccer field, not war." Genghis Khan, still studying him, leans back in his chair. "Football, you say? This is interesting. Your speed, it could be useful on the battlefield." A sharp glint of amusement flashes in his eyes, as he eyes the disoriented Mbappé. "You will join my army. We shall see how well your football tactics apply to war." Genghis Khan rises from his seat, towering over the young man. "We shall begin with a test. If you are as fast as you claim, then prove it. You have been given the chance to fight beside me. Let's see if you can survive." Before Mbappé can protest, he's ushered outside to a small training field. Surrounded by Mongol soldiers, he stands bewildered, staring at the strange weapons and harsh terrain. The generals give him a spear, a shield, and a small horse. They don't expect him to survive. After all, this is a man used to running a football field, not riding into battle or holding a sword. But Mbappé, ever the athlete, knows how to think on his feet. Genghis Khan watches from a distance, interested in how this footballer will handle the chaos of war. As the battle begins, the Mongol soldiers charge on horseback, thundering toward the enemy. Mbappé, in a complete blur of confusion, attempts to ride his horse, only to find himself struggling with the reins. The horse kicks up dirt as he tries to regain control. He clutches the spear awkwardly, but there's no time for hesitation. He spots an opening in the enemy's formation, his mind instinctively working like it would on a football field. He lowers his body, like he's about to dribble through a line of defenders, and charges forward. What follows next is a chaotic blur of kicks and awkward maneuvers. Mbappé's footwork on the field translates into rapid, unexpected movements on horseback. He speeds through the chaos, zigzagging, dodging arrows, and even knocking down a few of the enemy soldiers with his spear, using his speed to disorient them. For a moment, it's like watching a football match, not a war. The movement is fluid, graceful, almost choreographed. Mbappé dodges an arrow, narrowly misses a sword swipe, and uses his speed to escape danger. He's completely out of place, but somehow, it works. When the dust settles, and the battle ends in victory, Genghis Khan approaches Mbappé, eyes gleaming with respect. The soldiers are still catching their breath, amazed at what they've just witnessed. The young footballer has done something no one could have expected. He has adapted to the battlefield with grace, speed, and precision. "Not bad," Genghis Khan says, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You are indeed fast, Kylian. But can you fight in my army, as a true warrior? Or is this football all you are good for?" Mbappé looks at the warlord, his mind racing. This was not what he imagined when he thought about making history. But one thing is for sure, he was going to need to learn a whole new kind of strategy if he was going to survive in the 13th century. "I'll show you what I can do," Mbappé says, wiping the sweat from his brow. He may be out of place, but if there's one thing he knows, it's how to play a game, and this, he's starting to realize, is just a different kind of game. Mbappé stood awkwardly on the Mongol training grounds, feeling out of place in his modern-day sports gear. Around him, the Mongol soldiers, dressed in layers of thick leather and fur, practiced with swords and shields, their faces carved from years of battle. The ground beneath his feet was rough, the air thick with the scent of dust and sweat. He was supposed to be a warrior now, but the only weapons he had ever mastered were cleats and a football. Genghis Khan's generals stood around him, arms crossed, eyes hard with suspicion. Their silence was as oppressive as the heat. They expected him to act like one of them, ruthless, deadly, fierce. But how could he? He had never wielded a sword in his life. His mind raced as he searched for a way to fit in, to prove that he belonged here. The truth, however, was undeniable. He was a stranger in a world that could crush him with a single blow. The pressure mounted. "Show us your speed," Genghis Khan's voice echoed across the field. The warlord was perched atop a massive warhorse, his dark eyes glinting with amusement. "We've seen your games on the field. Show me what you can do on the battlefield." His tone was mocking, yet somehow, there was an edge of genuine curiosity. Mbappé's heart thudded in his chest. He was no warrior, but he was fast. That was his advantage. He'd always known how to move with purpose, how to read the game, how to make his body do what needed to be done. But now, with the weight of history on his shoulders, could he apply that to a battle? Could he survive here? The first test came sooner than he expected. One of the generals threw a horse's reins into his hands, a wide grin on his face. "Ride, footballer," he said. "We'll see how fast you are now." The horse was huge, its muscles rippling beneath its thick fur. Mbappé froze, his hands trembling on the reins. He had ridden a bike, a scooter, and a few times, even a mule at his family's ranch. But this was something else. The horse bucked under him, a wild animal with no interest in being controlled. "Hold on," one of the generals shouted, but Mbappé had already been thrown off, landing hard on the ground. Laughter erupted around him, the Mongols clearly enjoying his discomfort. But he didn't let it break him. He stood, wiped the dust from his face, and mounted the horse again. This time, he held on tighter, using his core to steady himself. But the horse was stubborn, and every time he thought he had it under control, it lurched forward again. The general who had mocked him earlier was still laughing, his face twisted in cruel amusement. "This is not the game you know," he taunted. "The horse does not fear you." But Mbappé didn't give up. He remembered how he used to think on the football field, always adapting, always improving. He took a deep breath and focused on the animal's movements. He watched the way it shifted its weight, how it responded to his subtle pulls on the reins. Slowly, he began to move with it, not against it. It was a dance, of sorts. A game of balance and timing. Within minutes, he was riding smoothly, guiding the horse with a firm yet gentle touch. The Mongols stopped laughing. Their eyes widened, watching in stunned silence as Mbappé controlled the beast, his movements fluid and confident. He had tamed the horse not through force, but through patience and skill. For the first time, the Mongols saw him not as a foreigner, but as someone capable of adapting to their world. A sense of respect began to grow in the air. Genghis Khan nodded approvingly, though his expression remained inscrutable. The generals quickly realized that this footballer was more than just a novelty. His speed, his ability to read and react, could be of use in battle. But could he apply that to warfare? Could he survive the brutality of the Mongol way? Over the next few days, Mbappé's training took a strange turn. Instead of learning to wield traditional weapons, he found himself incorporating his soccer knowledge into the drills. The Mongol soldiers, strong and intimidating in their own right, were used to using their brute force to overpower their enemies. But Mbappé's speed, agility, and quick thinking gave him an edge they didn't have. Instead of charging headfirst into combat, he taught them how to move in coordinated formations, using their speed and precision to overwhelm their opponents. It was an odd mix of football and military tactics, but to his surprise, it worked. One day, after a long training session, Genghis Khan pulled him aside. The warlord's eyes, which had once held nothing but suspicion, now gleamed with something akin to respect. "You move well," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Perhaps your ways have more value than I thought. Show me more." Mbappé, still reeling from the realization that he had made it this far, nodded and began to demonstrate. He used the terrain of the training grounds to illustrate his tactics. "It's all about timing," he said, his voice growing more confident as he spoke. "In football, it's about reading the game, predicting the next move before it happens." He organized the Mongol soldiers into tight formations, showing them how to execute quick passes and sudden changes in direction. They were hesitant at first, but as they practiced, they began to move with more fluidity, more precision. The generals started to see it. This wasn't just some game. This was a new way of thinking. A new way of fighting. As the days went on, Mbappé's influence on the Mongol army grew. He was no longer just a footballer, he was a strategist, a leader. He continued to refine his tactics, blending soccer-style formations with ancient Mongol warfare. He called his method the dribble charge, a tactic where soldiers would charge at the enemy in unpredictable patterns, confusing their opponents with speed and agility, much like football players dodging tackles on the field. His soldiers began to adopt these techniques, and soon, the Mongols were fighting not just with weapons, but with strategy. But just as things were starting to come together, an even greater challenge loomed on the horizon. Genghis Khan received word of a massive enemy army marching toward them, a force far larger than anything they had ever faced before. Mbappé's football-inspired strategies would be put to the ultimate test. With a war on the horizon and his new tactics under scrutiny, Mbappé had only one choice: adapt, or risk losing everything. The future of the Mongol Empire, and his place within it, depended on the next battle. The Mongol army was on the move again, and Mbappé could feel the tension in the air. They had received word that an enemy force, far larger than their own, was approaching from the east. The message had come like a dark cloud, casting a long shadow over the army's morale. It wasn't just another skirmish, this was the beginning of what could be a devastating war, one that might change the fate of the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan stood at the front of the war council, his eyes piercing as he surveyed the situation. "Prepare for battle," he commanded. "But we must do this differently. This enemy is large, and they will come with full force. Mbappé, it's time to put your theories to the test." Mbappé nodded, his stomach twisting in knots. This was it. His chance to prove that his football-inspired tactics weren't just a novelty, but a legitimate advantage. He could feel the weight of the entire army's expectations pressing down on him. But deep down, he knew one thing for sure: this was his game now. It wasn't a football match, but the rules remained the same. Speed, timing, and adaptability. He had to think like a player, and act like a general. As the army marched toward the battlefield, Mbappé spent every moment strategizing. He pored over maps, taking note of the enemy's positions, the terrain, and the weather. He was no longer just a footballer in the midst of ancient warriors, he had become their strategist, their eyes on the field. He began forming his plan. Mbappé's strategy was simple: use speed, confusion, and unexpected movements to outflank the enemy. He didn't want to fight like the Mongols traditionally did, with brute force and overwhelming numbers. He wanted to fight like a soccer team. His tactics revolved around using feints to mislead the enemy, rapid changes in direction to break their lines, and swift counterattacks. But unlike a football field, there were no clear goals to aim for, just open terrain and an enemy bent on annihilation. He gathered the generals, explaining his vision. "We need to think of this battle like a football match. I want my soldiers to operate like a team, fast, fluid, and unpredictable. The enemy will expect us to charge headfirst, but we'll do the opposite. We'll move swiftly, using our speed to confuse them. And when they're least expecting it, we'll strike." At first, the generals were hesitant. This was unlike any strategy they had ever seen. The Mongols were used to straightforward tactics: charge, strike, overwhelm. They didn't have time for fancy footwork. But after a few moments of contemplation, the realization hit them. The enemy was large, but they lacked mobility. If Mbappé's strategy worked, they could bypass strength with speed and cleverness. The plan was set. The Mongols would create the illusion of an all-out attack, but it would be a ruse. The real assault would come from the sides, catching the enemy off guard. As dawn broke, the battlefield was bathed in a blood-orange light, casting long shadows over the grass. The Mongol army, led by Mbappé, took their positions on the outer edges of a vast field. On the opposite side, the enemy forces waited, their banners waving in the breeze. Mbappé could see the size of their army from a distance. It was indeed massive. They had numbers on their side, but what they didn't have was Mbappé's speed. The first wave of the Mongols charged headlong into battle, just as expected. The enemy, seeing this, prepared for an all-out clash. But what they didn't anticipate was the sudden disappearance of half the Mongol forces into the underbrush, flanking them from the sides in perfect formations, using the terrain to their advantage. The Mongols moved in tight groups, darting in and out of enemy lines with the kind of precision that a football team would use to break through a defensive line. It was a blur of speed, soldiers moving with the fluidity of football players, passing the ball, or in this case, weapons, back and forth, confusing the enemy with their rapid movements. Mbappe's tactics were executed flawlessly. The first sign of success came when one of the Mongol units, using Mbappe's quick-change maneuver, bypassed the enemy's front lines and struck deep into their flank. The enemy was caught completely off guard. They had expected a direct assault, but instead, they were faced with a rapid, confusing series of attacks from all directions. The battle raged on, and the chaos of war began to unfold. The enemy soldiers, overwhelmed by the speed of the Mongol movements, struggled to adapt. Their ranks began to break apart as they tried to reposition, but Mbappe's tactics kept them on the defensive. It was as if the Mongols had transformed into a living, breathing force that couldn't be caught. Mbappé darted between the lines, moving like a blur through the battlefield, coordinating his soldiers as if they were players in a game. He used feints to draw enemy soldiers out of position, allowing his warriors to strike at their weak spots. It wasn't about strength, it was about movement, timing, and precision. One of the most striking moments came when Mbappé led a small group of soldiers in a daring charge. They moved quickly, zigzagging between the trees, drawing the enemy's attention away from the main force. With a sudden change of direction, they hit the enemy's vulnerable flank, causing complete chaos. The Mongols, using their speed and agility, began to break the enemy's formation from the inside. By midday, the battle was over. The Mongols had decisively defeated their enemies, but it wasn't through sheer force. It was through Mbappe's vision, his adaptation of football tactics to warfare. The enemy, while larger in number, had been caught off guard by the Mongols' speed and precision. Genghis Khan surveyed the battlefield, his expression unreadable. Mbappé stood beside him, catching his breath, his heart still pounding from the intensity of the fight. The soldiers around them cheered, but the warlord's attention was solely on Mbappé. "You have done well," Genghis Khan said, his voice low and steady. "Your tactics, they were unlike anything I've seen before. You've won today, not through strength, but through speed. You have earned your place here." Mbappé felt a surge of relief mixed with disbelief. He had done it. He had used his knowledge of football to help win a battle, one that, for a brief moment, had felt like nothing more than a game. But the reality of the Mongol battlefield was ever present, and he knew that this victory was just the beginning. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, Mbappé looked out over the battlefield. He had earned the respect of the Mongol generals, but he knew there was more to come. The real challenge lay ahead. If his strategies could win today's battle, what would tomorrow bring? And deep down, Mbappé knew, this game, this war, was far from over. The days that followed the victory were filled with a strange mix of celebration and tension. The Mongol army, once known for its ruthless, direct approach, had become something new. Something faster. Something more unpredictable. And it was all thanks to Mbappé. The respect he had earned from Genghis Khan and his generals was palpable, but with that respect came a heavy burden. The Mongols had won battles, yes, but the war was far from over. As Mbappé walked through the camp, his mind raced. The soldiers no longer viewed him as a foreigner. They saw him as one of their own, though he would always be something of an enigma to them. He had brought a new way of thinking to their ranks, a new form of strategy that relied on precision, teamwork, and speed. The Mongol warriors, who had once laughed at his football tactics, now used his methods as if they were second nature. But this success didn't come without its challenges. The Mongols had always been a brutal, unstoppable force, but now, their new way of fighting, fast, fluid, and strategic, had drawn the attention of neighboring empires. Some saw the Mongols as a force to be reckoned with, others saw them as a threat to be crushed. The most dangerous of these empires was the Western Kingdom, a sprawling empire with advanced siege weapons and a military that had long been feared across the land. The Western Kingdom's generals had heard of the Mongols' new tactics, and they were preparing for the inevitable clash. Mbappé could feel the pressure mounting. Genghis Khan had placed him in charge of his own elite unit, an army within an army. His dribble riders, as they had come to be called, were now a force unto themselves. These soldiers had undergone rigorous training, learning to use Mbappé's unorthodox tactics to their advantage. They no longer fought like the Mongols of old. They fought like a well-coordinated team, using speed, agility, and deception to overwhelm their enemies. In the mornings, Mbappé led his riders through grueling drills, pushing them to their limits. They practiced their formations, attacking in rapid bursts, retreating just as quickly, always staying one step ahead of the enemy. Mbappé taught them the value of patience, of waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't about overwhelming the enemy with force. It was about outsmarting them, confusing them, and then striking where it hurt the most. The training wasn't easy, and not everyone was on board with his methods. Some of the older, more traditional Mongol warriors still preferred the old ways, the brutal, head-on charge that had brought them so much success in the past. They saw Mbappe's tactics as dishonorable, cowardly even. But Genghis Khan, ever the visionary, supported his new general. "You are a warrior of the future," he told Mbappé. "And the future is faster, more intelligent. It will be your tactics that win us this war." Word came that the Western Kingdom had begun preparing for a siege, a massive, organized effort to break the Mongol stronghold. The kingdom had advanced weaponry, siege towers, giant catapults, and fortified walls that no enemy had ever breached. It was said that the Western Kingdom's generals had studied the Mongols' tactics and were preparing countermeasures to prevent them from using their newfound speed and agility. Mbappé stood at the edge of the Mongol camp, watching the horizon. The Western Kingdom's forces were vast, and their walls seemed impenetrable. For the first time since he arrived in this time, Mbappé felt a sense of doubt. His tactics had worked against smaller enemies, but could they withstand a full siege? The Mongols had always relied on overwhelming force. Now, they had to fight with speed and precision. Genghis Khan rode up beside him, as if sensing his uncertainty. "The enemy is strong," he said. "But they are not fast. And they will never anticipate what you are about to do." Mbappé spent hours studying the Western Kingdom's defenses. He knew the siege would be inevitable. The enemy was going to come, and they were going to hit hard. But he also knew that their weakness lay in their predictability. They would try to force the Mongols into a direct confrontation, expecting them to fight like they always had. He had a different idea. Instead of defending the walls or engaging in a traditional siege defense, Mbappé decided to use the terrain to his advantage. He ordered his Dribble riders to break the enemy's formations from within, creating chaos and confusion before they even had the chance to set up their siege weapons. It was the perfect blend of football strategy and military warfare. Mbappé's soldiers would move like players on the pitch, darting in and out of the enemy lines, creating openings, and attacking with speed. The enemy wouldn't know what hit them. "We'll make them chase us," Mbappé said to his generals, his voice steady. "They'll spend so much time trying to catch up that they won't even have time to set up their siege. By the time they do, we'll be ready to strike." The siege began, but as Mbappé had predicted, the enemy was unprepared for the Mongols' new tactics. Instead of the expected frontal assault, the Mongols launched a series of rapid, unpredictable strikes. Mbappé's Dribble riders darted through the battlefield like shadows, cutting down supply lines and sabotaging siege equipment before it could even be put to use. The Western Kingdom's army was thrown into disarray. Their generals had expected a slow, grinding war of attrition, but they were faced with a Mongol army that refused to be pinned down. Every time they thought they had the Mongols trapped, Mbappé's forces would slip away, like a well-executed counterattack in football. The enemy's heavy artillery was rendered useless as the Mongols attacked from multiple angles, never staying in one place long enough for the Western Kingdom to set up a proper defense. Mbappé's tactics, once seen as a novelty, had now become the Mongols' greatest weapon. As the battle raged on, Mbappé could feel the momentum shifting. His soldiers were starting to believe in the strategy, moving with the fluidity of a football team executing a perfect play. They had become a force that the enemy couldn't anticipate, couldn't counter. The siege dragged on for days, but by the time the Western Kingdom's forces realized what had happened, it was too late. The Mongols had dismantled their defenses piece by piece, and the once impenetrable walls of the Western Kingdom began to crumble. Mbappé's tactics had not only won the battle, they had broken the enemy's spirit. When the dust settled, the Mongol army stood victorious. Genghis Khan rode to the front of the camp, his eyes filled with approval. He looked at Mbappé, who had led his unit to success once again. "You've done it," Genghis Khan said, his voice full of respect. "You've shown me that a warrior is not just someone who can fight. A true warrior is someone who can think. And you've thought your way through this battle." Mbappé nodded, still taking in the enormity of what had just happened. The victory was his, but it was also the Mongol army's. They had learned to fight not just with strength, but with strategy, precision, and speed. They had become more than an army, they had become a team. As the Mongol forces celebrated their hard-won victory, Mbappé stood alone for a moment, gazing out over the battlefield. The war was far from over, and he knew that his strategies would continue to be tested. But for the first time, he truly felt like he belonged. He had brought something to the Mongol army that no one else could, something that would change the course of history. Mbappé stood in front of the Mongol War Council once again, only this time, the atmosphere was different. The previous victories had earned him a certain level of respect, but now, with the enemy forces retreating and the Mongols on the cusp of total conquest, the pressure was beginning to mount. Genghis Khan, ever the strategic mastermind, had decided it was time to elevate things. And he needed to see if Mbappé's unorthodox methods could hold up in an even higher stakes situation. It was time for a challenge. Tomorrow, we will hold a tournament, Genghis Khan declared, his voice echoing across the war tent. You will face the finest generals of the Mongol army. Show them that your methods are more than just clever tricks. Show them that you can lead us to victory in the toughest of situations. Mbappé raised an eyebrow. A tournament? He had only been with the Mongols for a short time, and already, he was being thrown into a competition with the very best warriors in the empire. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. The game, Genghis Khan continued, will be simple. Each of you will lead a group of soldiers through a series of challenges. The team that completes each challenge with the most precision and efficiency will be declared the winner. But there's a twist, no brute force. You must win with strategy, speed, and adaptability. Mbappé's mind raced. This wasn't just about military might. It was about applying everything he had learned on the football field, using his intellect, his ability to read the situation, and his speed to outmaneuver his opponents. It was his kind of game. But the Mongol generals? They were used to overwhelming force and direct combat. They had never been tested in this way. The next morning, the tournament began. Mbappé was placed in charge of a small unit of elite Mongol soldiers, his dribble riders, as they had come to be known. The challenges, though not life-threatening, were designed to test their tactics and adaptability. Each trial was set up like a mini-battle, navigating an obstacle course, retrieving an object from deep within enemy lines, and leading a simulated charge against a fortified position. As the first challenge began, Mbappé could already feel the weight of the moment. He knew the other generals would be watching, judging him and his unconventional methods. But he also knew this was his chance to prove once and for all that speed, precision, and strategy were the keys to success. This wasn't just about victory in battle, it was about redefining what it meant to fight like a Mongol. The first challenge was simple enough, a race to retrieve a flag from deep within a mock enemy camp. The flag was surrounded by several obstacles, including wooden barriers, narrow passageways, and mock enemy soldiers. The other Mongol generals, hardened by years of brutal battle, charged in headfirst, their teams galloping toward the objective with reckless abandon. They knew no other way but to overpower their opponents. But Mbappé, having learned from his time on the football field, saw things differently. He didn't just look at the flag. He looked at the obstacles, at the movements of his soldiers, and at the terrain. He saw the patterns, the ways they could avoid being detected and how they could move through the course with speed and precision. "Follow me," he barked to his unit. "Don't rush. Move swiftly. Like we're on the field." His soldiers hesitated at first, but soon, they fell into step. Instead of charging forward like the other teams, Mbappé's unit maneuvered around the obstacles, slipping between narrow gaps and staying low to the ground. They darted past the enemy soldiers, feinting and evading their attacks. Mbappé, at the front, moved like a player on the pitch, calculating, reacting, and leading with precision. As they reached the flag, Mbappé's team was ahead of the others, their movement so fluid it was as if they had been practicing this for years. They grabbed the flag, retraced their steps, and returned to the starting point with the same swift efficiency. The other generals, having charged in with brute force, had failed to outmaneuver the obstacles in the same way. It was an easy win for Mbappé. The next challenge was more complex. It involved retrieving a series of strategic items from different points within a simulated enemy camp, all while avoiding detection from mock sentries and bypassing several booby traps. This challenge was less about speed and more about stealth and precision. The Mongol generals were confident that their experience in silent ambushes would give them an edge. But once again, Mbappé had a different plan. While the other generals prepared to send in soldiers one by one, using traditional stealth techniques, Mbappé's strategy was unconventional. He split his team into small, agile groups, each with specific roles. One group would move quickly to disable the traps, another would distract the sentries, and the rest would gather the items. "Keep moving," Mbappé whispered as they began the challenge. "Never stay in one spot too long." As his soldiers moved through the simulated enemy camp, Mbappé kept them on the move, constantly shifting positions. They used their speed and agility to stay out of sight, slipping in and out of the shadows with ease. One by one, the other generals' teams were spotted by the sentries, their efforts quickly thwarted. Mbappé's team, however, was never caught. They moved like a well-oiled machine, efficiently collecting the items while evading detection. By the time the other teams had barely made it halfway through the course, Mbappé's team had already completed the challenge with near-perfect precision. The final challenge was the most difficult of them all, a mock assault on a fortified position. The enemy's walls were high, their defenses well constructed. The other generals immediately began to devise plans that relied on sheer force, battering rams, ladders, and a direct attack. But Mbappé wasn't interested in direct confrontation. He knew the walls could be breached, but it wouldn't be by brute strength. It would be by speed and deception. He studied the enemy's defense, noting the weak points in their positioning and the blind spots in their coverage. "We move like a fast break," Mbappé told his generals. "They're waiting for us to charge. Let's make them think we're coming from one side, and then hit them from another." Using his dribble riders, Mbappé executed a rapid series of feints. His soldiers moved quickly, darting between gaps in the defense, pretending to approach from one direction before suddenly shifting to another. The enemy, expecting a direct assault, was caught off guard by the speed and unpredictability of Mbappé's tactics. Mbappé led the final charge himself. With the enemy distracted by his team's movements, he led a small group of riders through a narrow gap in the wall. The defenders never saw them coming. As the gate fell, Mbappé's soldiers surged forward, overwhelming the last line of defense with speed and precision. As the dust settled and the mock battle ended, Mbappé stood before the war council again, his heart racing with excitement. His tactics had not only proven successful, they had completely revolutionized the way the Mongols fought. They had beaten their opponents not with strength, but with speed, strategy, and adaptability. The Mongol generals, once skeptical, now looked at him with newfound respect. Genghis Khan, standing in front of the war council, surveyed the battlefield with a thoughtful expression. He looked at Mbappé, his eyes full of admiration. "You have shown us the way forward," Genghis Khan said, his voice filled with approval. "You have proven that you can lead. You are no longer just a footballer. You are a general. You are my strategist." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Mbappé allowed himself a smile. It wasn't just the victory that mattered, it was the change he had brought to the Mongol army. They had learned to think, to move with precision, to strike with speed. But as the celebration roared around him, Mbappé knew the true battle was still ahead. The Western Kingdom was still out there, waiting for the Mongols to make their next move. The war wasn't over, but now, with his new tactics and the support of his army, Mbappé was more confident than ever. The Mongol army was about to enter a new era, and he would lead them into it. The sun hung low in the sky as Mbappé paced back and forth at the edge of the Mongol camp, the weight of what was to come settling heavily on his shoulders. Genghis Khan had already gathered his generals to discuss the next phase of their conquest, the siege of the Western Kingdom's capital. It was a city unlike any they had faced before, with walls that stretched higher than anything the Mongols had ever encountered. The Western Kingdom's defenses were legendary. Their armies had been fortified with advanced siege weapons, massive trebuchets, battering rams, and towers that could withstand even the fiercest of attacks. Mbappé's mind was consumed with the looming battle. He had successfully led his unit through previous victories, using his football-inspired tactics, but this was different. The Mongol army had never faced a siege like this. They were used to speed, precision, and swift attacks, not slow, grinding warfare. But the walls of the Western Kingdom's capital were a whole new challenge. Genghis Khan's voice boomed across the camp as he summoned Mbappé to the war council. "We will lay siege to their capital," he declared. "We will break their walls and destroy their defenses. But I will need your mind, Mbappé. Your speed and tactics. I will not use brute force. We must think our way inside." Mbappé's heart raced. Genghis Khan's faith in him was both exhilarating and terrifying. Could his strategies really work in a siege? Could he adapt his quick, agile warfare to a situation where speed was often the enemy? The Western Kingdom's capital sat atop a hill, surrounded by towering walls made of massive stone blocks. There were watchtowers at every corner, archers perched high above the walls, their eyes ever vigilant. The city's defenses were like nothing the Mongols had ever encountered. The walls were thick, and the gates were reinforced with iron, making it nearly impossible for traditional Mongol siege tactics to succeed. Mbappé knew that a direct attack would be futile. The Mongols had the numbers, but they didn't have the firepower to take down those walls. The idea of charging headfirst into battle was an old, familiar strategy for the Mongols, but it was one that would end in defeat here. His mind raced, as he tried to figure out how he could apply his football-like tactics to a full-scale siege. A siege wasn't like a regular battle. It wasn't about overwhelming the enemy with force, it was about patience, precision, and breaking the enemy's will. It was a waiting game. The Mongols had always won through quick, decisive strikes, but this would be different. He needed to outsmart the enemy, not overpower them. Mbappé gathered his dribble riders and began working on his strategy. The challenge wasn't just about breaching the walls, it was about breaking the Western Kingdom's defenses, step by step. He had to get creative. He spent hours studying the city's layout, the structure of the walls, and the movement of the enemy forces. The city was built on a hill, and the enemy had a clear advantage in terms of positioning. But Mbappé saw an opening. He realized that the Western Kingdom's forces were overconfident. They were so focused on their walls that they had neglected the possibility of a swift, unexpected strike. He gathered his generals together, explaining his plan. "We don't need to break through the walls directly," Mbappé said, his voice steady. "We need to move quickly, confuse them, and use their own arrogance against them. We'll strike at their supply lines, create chaos within their camp, and weaken them from the inside out. Then, we'll breach their defenses at their weakest point." The generals listened carefully, but there was skepticism in the air. The Mongols had never done battle like this before. They were used to direct, overwhelming force. The idea of using stealth, deception, and speed in a siege felt foreign to them. The first phase of Mbappé's plan involved disrupting the enemy's supply lines. The Western Kingdom relied on regular shipments of food, water, and reinforcements to maintain its siege defenses. Without those supplies, the kingdom's ability to hold out against the Mongols would be severely weakened. Mbappé's dribble riders, with their speed and agility, would be perfect for the task. Under the cover of darkness, Mbappé's unit slipped past the enemy's outer defenses, moving silently through the night. They struck at the supply caravans, cutting off the enemy's access to food and reinforcements. They moved swiftly, attacking like shadows, stealing supplies and leaving behind nothing but confusion and panic. The Western Kingdom's soldiers were caught off guard. Their supply lines had been breached, and their communication systems were in chaos. Mbappé's unit had done what they were best at, moving with such speed and precision that the enemy didn't even know what hit them. It was the first of many victories for the Mongols. With the enemy's supply lines compromised, Mbappé turned his attention to the city's walls. The Western Kingdom's archers were their main line of defense, firing arrows from the watchtowers at anything that moved. But Mbappé knew that these archers relied on patterns. They fired when they saw movement, and they followed strict rotations. "We'll break their rhythm," Mbappé told his generals. "We'll make them believe we're coming from one direction, and then we'll hit them from another." Using his knowledge of football formations, Mbappé created a series of deceptive maneuvers. His dribble riders began running along the outer walls, faking attacks and drawing the enemy's archers into a false sense of security. Then, at the last moment, they shifted positions, striking from a different angle entirely. The Western Kingdom's archers couldn't keep up. They were spread too thin, and the Mongols' unpredictable movements created confusion. Mbappé's speed had once again turned the tide, forcing the enemy to react to his movements instead of the other way around. With the Western Kingdom's defenses in disarray, it was time for the final phase of the plan, breaching the walls. Mbappé had set the stage for this moment by creating chaos within the enemy camp, weakening their confidence and their ability to defend. Now, with the enemy distracted and their forces scattered, the Mongols would strike. Mbappé's dribble riders were at the front of the assault, charging toward the city gates with an intensity that shocked the defenders. But instead of attacking directly, Mbappé had one last trick up his sleeve. He had planted explosive charges at the weakest points of the city walls, preparing for a controlled demolition. The explosion rocked the city, sending debris flying. The gates, once thought to be impregnable, were now a pile of rubble. The Mongols surged through the breach, overwhelming the last line of defense and flooding the city with their soldiers. The Western Kingdom had been caught completely off guard. They had focused so much on their walls and their defenses that they hadn't expected the Mongols to strike with such speed and precision. In the end, it wasn't the Mongols' sheer numbers that won the day, it was Mbappé's ability to outthink and outmaneuver the enemy. As the city fell and the Western Kingdom's forces surrendered, Mbappé stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching the remnants of the enemy army retreating in disarray. The Mongols had won, but not through brute force. They had won through intelligence, speed, and strategy. Genghis Khan approached Mbappé, a rare smile on his face. "You've done it again," he said, his voice low but full of admiration. "You've shown me that the future of warfare is not in force, but in strategy. You have proven your worth 1,000 times over. The Mongol Empire is yours to lead." Mbappé felt a sense of pride well up inside him, but he knew the war wasn't over. The Western Kingdom had fallen, but there were still many battles ahead. The Mongols had changed, and with Mbappé at their side, they would never fight the same way again. The morning sun rose over the Mongol camp, casting long shadows over the tents and soldiers still recovering from the previous battle. The siege of the Western Kingdom had been a resounding success, and word had already begun to spread across the empire. Mbappé's tactics had shaken the very foundation of Mongol warfare, turning the tide in ways no one had expected. His football-inspired strategies had made the Mongol army faster, smarter, and more unpredictable than ever before. But as the Mongol generals celebrated their victory, a new sense of responsibility weighed heavily on Mbappé's shoulders. The Mongol Empire was vast, its lands stretched from the steppes of Mongolia to the borders of Europe. They had conquered kingdoms and cities, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Yet, Mbappé knew the Mongols could not continue to win simply through strength alone. His methods had worked for now, but as their enemies grew wiser and more prepared, the time would come when even his unorthodox tactics might be tested beyond their limits. As the day wore on, Genghis Khan summoned him again, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Mbappé, his mind still racing from the battle, walked toward the warlord's tent, each step echoing with the pressure of the responsibility that had suddenly been thrust upon him. "You have done well, Kilian," Genghis Khan said, his tone surprisingly warm. The Mongol emperor rarely showed such admiration, but today was different. "You have changed the way we fight. You have brought us victories through speed and precision, methods that even I did not fully understand. The future of the Mongol Empire, it seems, rests in your hands." Mbappé felt a rush of pride, but it was quickly replaced by unease. His tactics had worked against the Western Kingdom, but there was still so much more to be done. Genghis Khan may have placed his trust in him, but the empire was facing greater challenges now. Enemies from the far corners of the world were rallying against the Mongols, and their old methods of conquest were no longer enough. "We have won many battles," Genghis Khan continued, his eyes steady. "But now, we must win the war. Your tactics, Kilian, they must be the foundation upon which this empire is built. We must change the way the Mongols fight." With his newfound authority came a challenge that Mbappé had not fully anticipated. He was now a general in the Mongol army, but he wasn't the only one with influence. There were other generals, veterans of countless battles, seasoned warriors who had fought alongside Genghis Khan for years. Many of them respected Mbappé's intelligence, but others were less than pleased with his sudden rise to power. In the days following the victory over the Western Kingdom, Mbappé faced quiet resistance from some of the older generals. They saw his methods as unconventional, untested, and far too reliant on the element of surprise. They preferred the old ways, the brutal, relentless charge that had made the Mongols feared across the world. They believed in overwhelming the enemy through sheer force, not speed and strategy. Mbappé knew that he couldn't simply rely on his football-inspired tactics to win over these seasoned warriors. He needed to prove that his methods were not just a novelty, but a new way of fighting that could win wars, not just battles. He gathered his closest allies, the leaders of the Dribble riders, and began working on his next big plan. The Mongol army had begun its long march westward, its sights set on the kingdoms that lay beyond the Western Kingdom's borders. The campaign was about to enter a new phase. Mbappé knew that his next challenge would be more difficult than any they had faced so far. The enemy was no longer a scattered force, they were organized, united, and prepared to fight back. "We will face them head-on," Genghis Khan declared during one of the War Council meetings. "We will show them the might of the Mongols." But Mbappé wasn't so sure. He knew that brute force alone would not win the day. The enemy had learned from their past defeats. They had studied the Mongols and had already begun preparing for their next move. If the Mongols were to continue their campaign with success, they needed to be smarter than their enemies. They needed to outthink them. As Genghis Khan spoke of battle plans, Mbappé quietly worked on his own strategy. He knew that the Mongols had to fight with the same speed and precision that had made them successful in their earlier battles. They couldn't afford to charge headfirst into another siege or be lured into a fight they weren't ready for. His plan was simple but risky. Instead of fighting the enemy on their terms, he would lead the Mongols in a series of hit-and-run tactics. They would attack where the enemy least expected, using deception and surprise to gain the upper hand. It would be a battle of minds as much as it was of strength. In the weeks that followed, Mbappé worked tirelessly to prepare his Dribble riders and the rest of the Mongol forces for the new approach. He had to teach them to think on their feet, to move as a coordinated unit, and to be unpredictable. It wasn't enough for them to just follow orders, they had to be able to adapt, to adjust on the fly, and to read the situation as it unfolded. Mbappé's training methods grew more intense as the army advanced. He taught his soldiers to use the terrain to their advantage, how to move quickly through forests, how to disguise their movements, how to make their enemies think they were somewhere they were not. He showed them how to use misdirection, how to feint one way and strike another. The Mongol warriors, once rigid and reliant on direct confrontation, were starting to move with the fluidity of athletes, ready to adapt to whatever situation they encountered. But it wasn't just about physical training. Mbappé also worked on their mental preparation. He encouraged his soldiers to think like a team, not as individuals. He taught them the importance of communication and coordination, of anticipating what their teammates would do next. It wasn't just about speed and strength, it was about working together to outsmart the enemy. As the Mongol army neared the borders of the next kingdom, Mbappé felt the weight of the upcoming conflict. His tactics had proven successful in previous battles, but the stakes were higher now. The enemy had been preparing for the Mongol onslaught for months, and they were ready. This would be the true test of Mbappe's methods. If they succeeded here, the Mongols could secure their dominance for generations. But if they failed, it could be the end of the empire. The generals continued to argue over strategy, some of them clinging to the old ways, others willing to give Mbappe's approach a chance. Mbappé could see the tension in the air. His influence was growing, but so was the resistance. Every victory brought new enemies, and the lines between allies and opponents were becoming blurred. As the Mongol army prepared for battle, Mbappé stood at the edge of the camp, looking out over the horizon. The world seemed impossibly vast, and the future was uncertain. But one thing was clear, the Mongol Empire was changing, and he was at the heart of that transformation. The war was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The tension in the Mongol camp was palpable. The drums of war had already begun to echo through the hills, and the camp was alive with the hustle of soldiers preparing for battle. This was no ordinary clash, it was the beginning of the largest military campaign in history, a war that would determine the fate of the Mongol Empire. Mbappé stood at the edge of the camp, gazing out over the horizon. His heart pounded in his chest. He had faced battles before, led his men through chaos, and emerged victorious. But this? This was different. The enemy they were about to face was not just another kingdom or scattered army, it was a coalition of the greatest powers of the known world. The Western Kingdom had rallied its allies, the Eastern Empire, the Southern Confederation, and even the elusive desert tribes that had long been a threat to the Mongols. They had all come together with one goal, to stop the Mongol juggernaut, to quash the new methods of warfare that Mbappé had introduced. The Mongol Empire had been forged through brutal conquest, but now, with Mbappé's unorthodox strategies taking center stage, the Mongols had something that their enemies didn't: speed, precision, and the element of surprise. Still, even Mbappé knew that this would be the ultimate test. His tactics had won battles, but now, they would have to face an enemy that was prepared, unified, and expecting the unexpected. Genghis Khan had placed his trust in Mbappé, and that trust had carried him far. But with the Mongol Empire on the line, Mbappé could feel the weight of his role growing heavier by the day. As he approached Genghis Khan's war tent, he steeled himself for what was to come. Inside the war tent, Genghis Khan was already surrounded by his generals. The mood was tense. The maps spread out on the table were dotted with red markers, each representing the locations of enemy forces. The Mongols were outnumbered, their enemies united and entrenched in their positions. The battle would not be won by sheer force, it would be won by strategy, precision, and the ability to move faster than the enemy could react. "I have seen your methods, Mbappé," Genghis Khan said, his voice steady. "I have seen how you use speed and deception to win. But this time, it will not be enough. You will need to think even further ahead. The enemy knows your tactics. They will be ready for you." Mbappé nodded, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He had taught the Mongol army to think like a team, to move like players on a football field, but now, they would face an enemy that had studied their every move. The challenge wasn't just to win, it was to outsmart an enemy that had come prepared. The Mongol army would have to play a game of chess, while their opponents were still thinking in terms of checkers. "We cannot fight them head-on," Mbappé said, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "The only way to defeat them is to make them think we're coming from one place, and then hit them from another. We need to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time." Genghis Khan's eyes narrowed. "What do you propose?" Mbappé stood over the map, tracing lines across it with his finger. "We'll split our forces into smaller units, using speed and deception to confuse the enemy. We'll make them think we're attacking from the front, while we hit their flanks and rear. The key is to make them believe they're winning, and then, when they've stretched themselves too thin, we'll hit them where it hurts." The battle began at dawn, with the Mongol forces charging forward in full force. The enemy, confident in their defensive positions, prepared for the onslaught. They were expecting the Mongols to follow their traditional tactics, a direct attack, full of power and brutality. But instead, the Mongol army began to split, moving in small, fast units, darting through the terrain with incredible precision. The first phase of Mbappé's plan was simple: create confusion. As the Mongols attacked from one direction, the enemy's generals scrambled to reposition their forces. The Mongols moved like a flock of birds, shifting, changing direction at a moment's notice. Every time the enemy thought they had a clear target, the Mongols would disappear into the trees or shift their attack to a different point. In the thick of the battle, Mbappé's Dribble riders led the charge. They moved with a speed and fluidity that left the enemy stunned. Instead of charging directly at the enemy, they feigned attacks, running circles around their opponents, drawing them in and then disappearing. They used the terrain to their advantage: mountains, forests, rivers, all obstacles that slowed the enemy's movement, but which the Mongols navigated with ease. The enemy didn't know what hit them. They were used to a different kind of battle, where the clash of swords and shields was the ultimate measure of victory. But this was something else entirely. The Mongols weren't fighting with brute force, they were fighting with precision, agility, and deception. As the battle raged on, Mbappé saw the cracks forming in the enemy's lines. They were stretched too thin, trying to cover too many positions. It was time to strike the final blow. In a swift, calculated move, he ordered his Dribble riders to break off from the main force and move toward the enemy's rear. They were to strike at the supply lines, destroy the food, weapons, and ammunition that the enemy had relied on to sustain their forces. The move was risky, but Mbappé knew it was their best shot. If they could cripple the enemy's supplies, the battle would be over. The Dribble riders, moving faster than anyone could anticipate, slipped through the enemy's defenses, cutting off the supply lines and setting fire to the enemy's reserves. The shock was immediate. The enemy's forces were thrown into disarray. The Mongols, seeing their opportunity, launched a full-scale attack, overwhelming the now disorganized army. Mbappé, leading the charge, could feel the tide turning. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when his tactics would prove once and for all that speed, precision, and intelligence were the keys to victory. The Mongol forces surged forward, breaking through the enemy's defenses with ease. As the battle ended and the dust settled, Mbappé stood amidst the wreckage, his heart still racing. The Mongols had won, not through strength, but through strategy, speed, and adaptability. The enemy, once confident in their overwhelming numbers and powerful defenses, had been outmaneuvered. Genghis Khan rode up to him, his face filled with pride. "You've done it again," he said, his voice filled with approval. "You've shown the world that the Mongols are more than just warriors. We are a force to be reckoned with. And it is your mind, your tactics, that have made us stronger." Mbappé nodded, his chest swelling with pride, but he knew this was just one victory. The war was far from over. There were still enemies to face, still battles to be fought. But for the first time, he felt that the Mongol army was more than just an unstoppable force, it was a force of intelligence, speed, and adaptability. As the Mongol army prepared for their next campaign, Mbappé stood at the edge of the camp, gazing out over the battlefield. The empire had changed, and he had changed with it. He had proven that speed and strategy could conquer even the most powerful forces. The Mongol way of war was no longer just about overwhelming force. It was about using your mind, your agility, and your understanding of the game. The world was watching, and the Mongols were ready to show everyone that they weren't just the conquerors of the past, they were the conquerors of the future. The Mongol Empire had reached the height of its power. Under Genghis Khan's rule, it had swept across the world like a storm, taking city after city, kingdom after kingdom. And now, it was time for the final push, the last great conquest, the one that would solidify the Mongols as the most powerful empire the world had ever known. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. The enemy was no longer just a disjointed force, it was a coalition of the last great kingdoms in the known world, all gathered together in one final stand against the Mongol invasion. They had watched the Mongols rise, seen them conquer with speed and precision, and now they were preparing for their last, desperate counterattack. The enemy had learned from every battle. They had studied the Mongol tactics and adapted. They had prepared defenses stronger than anything the Mongols had faced before. And Mbappé, now a seasoned strategist, knew that this would be his greatest challenge yet. The enemy had created a massive fortified city, one that even Genghis Khan's Mongols could not easily break. The walls were high and reinforced with steel, the gates were fortified with spikes and thick wood, and the city was surrounded by deep trenches filled with sharpened stakes. It was a place designed for defense, a place where every attack would be met with overwhelming force. Mbappé knew that if they attacked the city head-on, they would lose countless men in a futile assault. The enemy's defenses were too strong, too well organized. And yet, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the Mongol Empire on his shoulders. This was the final hurdle. If they didn't succeed here, all the victories they had earned so far would be for nothing. Genghis Khan stood beside him, his face unreadable. "You've led us to victory before," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with meaning. "Your tactics have changed the way we fight. But this time, Mbappé, this will be different. You will need more than speed. You will need to outthink them." Mbappé nodded, his mind racing. He had already outwitted the enemy before, using speed and deception. But this wasn't just a battle of numbers, it was a battle of minds. And Mbappé's greatest weapon wasn't his speed, but his ability to think ahead, to predict his opponent's every move. As the Mongol army gathered on the outskirts of the city, Mbappé worked tirelessly on his strategy. The enemy had seen his tactics before, and they were ready for them. They were expecting the Mongols to come at them with brute force, to charge head-on and try to break through their defenses. But Mbappé had something else in mind. This battle wasn't going to be won through strength alone, it was going to be won by misdirection. He gathered his generals and presented his plan. "We'll attack the city, but not directly," he said, his voice calm but filled with confidence. "We'll create a diversion, something that will make the enemy believe we're coming from one direction, while we hit them from another." The generals listened carefully, their eyes narrowing as they studied the map. Mbappé's plan was bold, too bold for some. He intended to divide the Mongol forces, creating confusion and chaos on the battlefield. A few units would feign an attack on the city's main gate, while the rest of the Mongol army would slip around the back and attack the enemy's weakest point. "We will fight like a football team," Mbappé continued. "We'll pass the ball in unexpected ways, confuse them with our movements, and then strike when they least expect it." There was a brief silence in the room. The generals exchanged glances, unsure whether they could trust such an unorthodox plan. But Genghis Khan, watching closely, nodded slowly. "Do it," he said, his voice steady. "Make them regret underestimating you." The battle began at dawn, with the Mongol forces spreading out across the battlefield. The main force, led by Mbappé, made their way toward the front gates of the city, as expected. They were met by the enemy's defenses, which had been fortified with traps and heavy artillery. The enemy's generals, convinced that the Mongols would attack head-on, prepared their forces for a brutal confrontation. But as the Mongols approached the gates, Mbappé's forces suddenly veered off, moving quickly toward the city's rear. The enemy, seeing the Mongols' forces at the front, focused all their attention on them. They believed the Mongols were preparing for a full-scale attack, and they began positioning their forces for a defense. But what the enemy didn't know was that Mbappé's forces had already infiltrated the city's rear defenses. They moved silently through the night, avoiding the enemy's watchful eyes and slipping past the barriers. It was like a football team executing a perfectly timed play, each unit moving in sync, passing the ball, or in this case, weapons, back and forth, confusing the enemy with every step. As the Mongols pushed forward, the enemy began to feel the pressure. Their forces, stretched thin and spread out across the city, were suddenly caught off guard. They had expected a frontal assault, but Mbappé's plan had turned everything upside down. The Mongol army, using their speed and precision, was now attacking from multiple angles, breaking the enemy's defenses one by one. Mbappé's Dribble riders were at the forefront of the assault, moving like shadows through the city streets. They struck with lightning speed, attacking the enemy's supply lines, sabotaging their weapons, and cutting off their communication. The enemy was in chaos, no one knew where the Mongols would strike next, and their once impenetrable defenses were beginning to crumble. The final blow came when Mbappé led a small group of elite riders toward the enemy's central command. The gates had been breached, and the enemy's command structure was in disarray. Mbappé's unit cut through the remaining enemy forces, striking the heart of their leadership. With their generals scattered, the remaining enemy soldiers surrendered, unable to fight back without their leaders. As the battle ended and the dust began to settle, Mbappé stood at the heart of the city, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The Mongols had won again, but it wasn't just through force, it was through intelligence, speed, and deception. The enemy had been outmaneuvered at every turn, never able to keep up with the Mongols' unpredictable tactics. Genghis Khan rode up to him, his face full of approval. "You've done it," he said, his voice calm but filled with respect. "Once again, you have proven that the Mongols are not just warriors of brute strength, but warriors of the mind. You have won this war before it even began." Mbappé smiled, but the weight of the victory didn't settle on him just yet. The war was far from over, and the Mongols had many more battles to fight. But for the first time, he felt that his methods, his way of thinking, his unorthodox approach, had become more than just a strategy. They had become a way of life for the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan's vision had always been one of conquest. But now, thanks to Mbappé, that vision had expanded. The Mongols were no longer just the unstoppable force they had been before. They were an empire built on speed, strategy, and adaptability. And as long as Mbappé was by their side, they would continue to conquer the world, not with sheer force, but with intelligence and precision. The camp was still, unusually quiet after the battle. The air was thick with the scent of victory, but beneath the celebration, there was a subtle unease. The Mongol Empire had achieved its greatest triumph yet, but Mbappé knew the cost of such victories. Every win drew more attention, more eyes watching the Mongols, and some of those eyes weren't friendly. As the Mongol army marched away from the smoking ruins of the Western Kingdom's capital, Mbappé found himself caught in a strange limbo. He had led them to victory, had helped change the very nature of their warfare, but with each conquest, there was a growing sense of pressure, an unspoken weight that he couldn't shake off. The other generals, once skeptical, now regarded him with a mix of admiration and wariness. Genghis Khan, despite his approval, had started to distance himself. Was it because he felt his empire slipping out of his control? Was he threatened by the rise of this strange, modern strategist in his ranks? Mbappé had done what was asked of him. His tactics had outsmarted the enemy time and again. He had revolutionized the way the Mongols fought, but now, as the dust settled from the last battle, he knew the real test had only just begun. As they set up camp for the night, Mbappé could feel the cold stares of some of the older generals who had once looked down on him. They were still around, and though they had quietly accepted his tactics out of necessity, their respect felt hollow. In the Mongol hierarchy, respect was earned through strength, not ideas. And while Mbappé had proven himself on the battlefield, there was always a lingering doubt among the more traditional generals that his methods, his reliance on speed, deception, and intelligence, were a threat to the Mongol way. A few of them had tried to meet with him after the battle, their voices low and insistent. They told him, in no uncertain terms, that his tactics would only take the Mongols so far. "We are warriors," one of them said, his voice gravelly and firm. "We don't win battles by running circles around our enemies. We win them by crushing them beneath our feet." The words echoed in Mbappé's mind, and he couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could keep pushing the Mongol army to fight in his way. Would they tire of his strategies, of his constant reinvention of their tactics? The Mongol army had always been a force of nature, unstoppable, overwhelming. But now, they were something else. Something new. They were starting to become what Mbappé had always believed was the key to success, a team, capable of thinking, adapting, and responding with precision. But could they maintain this new identity in the face of their own tradition? The general's wariness was understandable. The Mongol way was about dominance, not finesse. They conquered through strength, through sheer force. Mbappé's methods, though effective, seemed to undermine that. They questioned his reliance on tactics that weren't true Mongol. Mbappé stood by the campfire late into the night, watching the flickering flames cast shadows on the faces of the Mongol warriors. Genghis Khan had been quiet since the last battle, and Mbappé had noticed the subtle shifts in the way the emperor interacted with him. He could feel the unspoken tension, the silent acknowledgement that he was no longer just a general in the Mongol army. He had become something more. Something that even Genghis Khan couldn't fully control. The Mongol emperor had always been a force of nature in his own right. He was a conqueror, a leader who demanded loyalty, fear, and respect. But now, Mbappé's influence seemed to be growing, and Genghis Khan had begun to pull away, perhaps not because he doubted Mbappé, but because he understood that this was no longer just a military campaign. It was a shift in the very fabric of the empire. Mbappé had changed the way the Mongols fought, but in doing so, he had also changed the way they viewed the world. And that, more than anything, was what worried Genghis Khan. Would the Mongol warriors still listen to him as they followed Mbappé's lead? Would the empire he had spent a lifetime building survive the transformation? In the quiet of the night, Genghis Khan found Mbappé alone by the fire. The old warlord studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You've done well," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "But you must remember, Kilian, the Mongols are not just a team. We are a force. We do not change our ways for anyone. We make our own rules." Mbappé nodded, his mind racing. He knew Genghis Khan was right. There was no place in the Mongol army for weakness, no place for hesitation. But his methods were working. They had already proven themselves in battle. What he was doing, what he had brought to the Mongols, was more than just a new strategy. It was a new way of life. "I understand," Mbappé replied. "But we cannot keep fighting the same way, Khan. Our enemies are learning. They're adapting. And we must, too. If we stay stuck in the past, we'll be left behind." Genghis Khan's eyes narrowed. "We fight with strength," he said firmly. "That will never change." The next morning, Mbappé's instincts proved right. As the Mongol army prepared to march on the next kingdom, word came that the traditionalists in the empire, the generals who still favored brute force, had begun to rally the soldiers around them. Whispers spread like wildfire through the camp, of discontent with Mbappé's rise and his unorthodox tactics. They were not happy with the changes he had introduced. The old warriors, the ones who had grown up with the Mongol way of fighting, felt that the empire was beginning to lose its edge. This was no longer just a battle against external enemies. The real war was beginning to brew within the Mongol Empire itself. A dangerous faction had begun to form, led by the old generals and backed by those who still believed that the Mongols should fight with their traditional methods. These generals, while not openly challenging Genghis Khan, were beginning to question the wisdom of Mbappé's influence. If they had their way, they would return to the old ways of conquest, powerful, overwhelming, and unyielding. It wasn't long before Mbappé's spies brought word of an underground movement within the Mongol camp. The faction of traditionalists, led by a few of the most respected generals, had started to secretly prepare for a possible confrontation with those who supported the new tactics. They had become increasingly hostile toward Mbappé, believing that his influence would eventually weaken the empire's strength. Mbappé knew that this could be the beginning of something far more dangerous than any battle he had fought. His greatest enemy now wasn't just the kingdoms that stood in their way, it was the very heart of the Mongol Empire itself. His rise had been swift, but the question was, would the empire that he had helped reshape allow him to lead it into the future? The Mongol Empire had always been a land of contradictions. From the outside, it seemed an unstoppable force, a vast, fierce army that could conquer any enemy in its path. But within the empire's ranks, tensions were beginning to bubble to the surface. The unity that had once held the Mongol forces together was starting to fracture. Mbappé stood in the war tent, surrounded by the elite generals who had supported him from the beginning. He had spent countless hours strategizing with them, refining his tactics, and leading them to victory after victory. But now, the weight of leadership felt heavier than ever before. The murmurs of dissent were louder. Some of the oldest generals, the ones who had fought with Genghis Khan during his rise, were growing increasingly vocal in their opposition to Mbappé's methods. In the weeks since the victory over the Western Kingdom, Mbappé had noticed a shift in the camp. The soldiers, once loyal to Genghis Khan, had started questioning the new strategies that had brought the Mongols so much success. They were proud of their heritage, proud of the way they fought, head-on, relentlessly, with an iron will. And now, it seemed, that heritage was under threat. There was a movement brewing within the army, one that was slowly gaining momentum. The traditionalists, led by some of the most respected generals, had begun to question the wisdom of Mbappé's rise to power. In the war council tent, Mbappé could feel the eyes of the generals on him. They were silent, but their presence was unmistakable. It wasn't just Genghis Khan's empire anymore, it was his, too. And with that power came responsibility. If he failed, it wasn't just his men who would suffer, it was the entire Mongol Empire. One of the senior generals, Baidar, a fierce warrior with a long history of battles, spoke first. His voice was cold and direct, as it always was. "Killian," he said, his eyes narrowing, "you've led us well so far, but we cannot continue to fight like this. Your methods may work in small battles, but they will not work in the long run. The Mongols were forged by blood, sweat, and iron. We do not fight like this." Mbappé's heart clenched. This was the same argument he had heard over and over again from the traditionalists. They viewed his strategies, his reliance on speed, deception, and unpredictable tactics, as a sign of weakness. They wanted to return to the old ways, to the time when the Mongols had struck fear into the hearts of their enemies with sheer power and dominance. "I've seen what works, Baidar," Mbappé replied, his voice calm but firm. "Speed and precision have won us battles. They've won us victories against enemies who were more powerful than us. If we go back to brute force, we'll fall behind." The generals exchanged uneasy glances. Baidar wasn't the only one who felt this way. Mbappé could sense the growing unrest in the room. The loyalty that had once united the Mongol army was now being tested in ways he hadn't anticipated. Over the next few days, the situation worsened. The traditionalists had begun to rally support among the lower-ranking soldiers, feeding them the idea that Mbappé's methods were weakening the Mongol spirit. They spoke of the glory days, the days when the Mongols had fought like titans, charging through enemy lines with sheer force. The idea that the Mongols were now relying on stealth and strategy was anathema to them. Mbappé spent the following days moving through the camp, trying to assess the mood of his soldiers. He spoke with the generals who supported him, but even they were starting to question his ability to hold the army together. The whispers of dissent were growing louder with each passing day. Some soldiers had already begun to refuse orders, hesitant to follow a general who was seen as an outsider to the Mongol way of war. The worst part of it all was that the opposition wasn't just coming from the older generals, it was coming from the very core of the Mongol leadership. Some of the younger, more ambitious leaders had begun to voice their support for the old ways, hoping to climb the ranks by aligning themselves with the traditionalists. Mbappé had become a symbol of the change, but now, he was also a symbol of division. Genghis Khan, who had once been Mbappé's greatest ally, seemed more distant. The emperor, once full of praise for his innovations, now kept to himself more often. Mbappé knew that the Mongol leader was wrestling with his own fears. If Mbappé's tactics continued to win victories, the Mongols would evolve, but that evolution might undermine everything Genghis Khan had built. It came to a head one evening in the war council. Genghis Khan had called a meeting, summoning both Mbappé and the leaders of the traditionalist faction to discuss the future of the Mongol army. Mbappé walked into the tent with his head held high, though his heart beat with an intensity he hadn't felt before. This was no longer about tactics, it was about the future of the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan stood at the head of the table, his eyes scanning the room. The weight of the decision was clear. The empire was changing, and he knew that whatever decision was made here would define the future. "Killian," Genghis Khan said, his voice heavy, "you've proven your worth in battle. But there are those here who believe the Mongols must remain true to their roots. The traditionalists feel that your tactics are undermining the Mongol spirit." Mbappé's heart clenched. This was the moment he had feared, the moment when his methods would be judged not by their effectiveness, but by their very existence. He had always known that there were risks to changing the Mongol way of war. But now, standing before the leaders of the empire, he realized how deep those risks ran. Baidar, standing beside Genghis Khan, spoke again. His voice was firm and unyielding. "We cannot continue to fight with the speed of a rabbit. We are wolves. We are meant to strike with force, not dance around our enemies. If we follow this path, we risk losing our soul." Mbappé looked at Baidar, his expression calm but resolute. "I'm not asking you to abandon our strength. I'm asking you to embrace our future. The world is changing. If we don't change with it, we'll be left behind." For a long moment, the room was silent. The Mongol leaders, both traditionalists and reformists, looked between each other, unsure of what to do next. The decision that Genghis Khan made would decide the fate of the empire, and it wasn't clear whether the Mongols would continue their brutal march forward or if they would fall back into old patterns. Finally, Genghis Khan spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The empire will not be divided. We will not go back to the old ways, nor will we abandon them. Killian, you will continue to lead with your tactics, but you will do so in harmony with the traditionalists. We will use both strength and strategy, speed and power." Mbappé's heart raced. Genghis Khan had made his decision, but it wasn't a victory, not yet. The empire had to find a balance between the new and the old, and that meant the conflict within the Mongol ranks would not end with a single order. It was a compromise, a fragile truce between two conflicting visions. The uneasy truce that Genghis Khan had declared didn't bring the peace Mbappé had hoped for. Instead, it created a simmering tension within the Mongol camp, one that threatened to boil over at any moment. Though Genghis Khan had given his decree, the division between the traditionalists and the reformists was far from settled. While some generals grudgingly accepted the new tactics, others quietly nurtured their resentment, seeing Mbappé's influence as a threat to the Mongol way of life. The army marched westward, as planned, with the goal of conquering new territories. But the campaign was no longer just about conquering lands, it was about conquering minds. Mbappé had earned his place, but with each victory, the voices of dissent grew louder. The older generals, who had once been his allies, began to whisper among themselves, questioning his leadership. Even among the soldiers, there were murmurs about the future of the empire. Some believed that the Mongols had lost their edge, that the empire was becoming soft, less fearsome. They had stopped being the predators of the battlefield and had become something different. Mbappé could feel the eyes of his fellow generals on him as he walked through the camp. There were still those who admired his vision, but there were just as many who were waiting for him to fail. The pressure was mounting, and with it, the realization that the road ahead would be harder than he had anticipated. As the army settled into their camp one evening, Mbappé received word of something that made his blood run cold. A faction of the traditionalists had begun to quietly gather support from within the ranks. Led by Baidar, the most vocal critic of Mbappé's tactics, the faction was growing in numbers. Whispers of rebellion had spread like wildfire. The old warriors, those who had fought alongside Genghis Khan from the very beginning, were beginning to see Mbappé as a threat to the empire they had built. They believed that the Mongols were straying too far from their roots, that Mbappé's reliance on speed and deception was weakening their strength. Mbappé could no longer deny the truth, there was a rebellion brewing within his own ranks. It was not a rebellion in the traditional sense, with swords drawn and banners raised, but rather a rebellion of ideologies. The traditionalists were preparing to challenge him not with battle, but with words, with influence, and perhaps even with betrayal. One night, as Mbappé sat alone by the campfire, a messenger approached him with urgent news. The messenger spoke in hushed tones, but Mbappé could hear the weight of the words. "General Baidar is rallying support. His faction is growing stronger. They are calling for the Mongols to return to their roots. They want to remove you from command." Mbappé's stomach churned. He had always known that his position was precarious, but he hadn't realized the depth of the opposition he faced. Baidar and the other traditionalists were not just questioning his tactics, they were questioning his very place in the Mongol army. They didn't just want to challenge him, they wanted to erase him. The next few days were a blur of strategic meetings and whispered conversations. Mbappé knew he had to act quickly, before the rebellion gained too much momentum. He reached out to his most loyal allies within the army, those who had followed him since the early days of his rise. Together, they began to plan their next move. But the atmosphere in the camp was growing increasingly tense. The soldiers could feel the shift in the air. What had once been a united Mongol force was now a divided one. The traditionalists had made their dissatisfaction known, and their influence was spreading. They had begun to sabotage some of Mbappé's strategies, undermining his authority with small but deliberate acts of defiance. It wasn't enough to topple him, but it was enough to make him question whether his position was as secure as it once seemed. One evening, as the camp settled into an uneasy silence, Mbappé gathered his closest allies in the command tent. The firelight flickered as they exchanged glances, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. "We cannot let this go on any longer," Mbappé said, his voice low but resolute. "Baidar and his faction have begun to rally the soldiers against me. If we don't act soon, we risk losing the support of the entire army." His most trusted generals, Dribble, Subutai, and the others, nodded in agreement. They had seen the signs, too. The rebellion was not just a threat to Mbappé's position, it was a threat to the future of the Mongol Empire itself. "We must unite the army," Dribble said, his voice firm. "If we don't, the Mongols will fall apart. We must remind the soldiers of why we fight. We must remind them that we are one empire, one force, and that no faction can tear us apart." The next few days were filled with quiet maneuvering. Mbappé knew that the key to winning this war wasn't through force, it was through persuasion. He would have to confront Baidar and his followers, not on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of the Mongol soldiers. He began to meet with the generals and soldiers who still supported him, rallying them to his cause. He reminded them of what had made the Mongols great, their ability to adapt, to learn, to grow stronger with each victory. He spoke of their new way of fighting, faster, smarter, more efficient, and how it had already brought them victories that would have been impossible under the old ways. But Baidar and the traditionalists weren't giving up easily. They had their own plans. They began to call the soldiers to arms, preaching the values of the old Mongol way of fighting, strength, dominance, and sheer power. They spoke of the glory days, when the Mongols were feared for their raw might, when they charged through the enemy lines without hesitation, without thinking. Mbappé knew this would be his toughest challenge yet. He was no longer just fighting for the Mongols' future, he was fighting for the very soul of the empire. If he failed, the Mongols would revert to their old ways, and the empire's unity would be shattered. The day of reckoning came swiftly. Mbappé stood in front of his army, facing Baidar and the traditionalist faction. It wasn't a battle of swords, but a battle of wills. The generals and soldiers gathered, divided into two factions, those who supported Mbappé's vision of a new Mongol empire, and those who stood with Baidar, believing that the Mongols could not survive without their ancient traditions. "This is our future," Mbappé said, his voice echoing across the camp. "We cannot be bound by the past. We must move forward. We must be faster, smarter, and more adaptable. Only then can we lead the world, not with fear, but with respect." Baidar stood tall across from him, his eyes cold and determined. "Your methods have worked for now," he said, his voice cutting through the air. "But they will not last. We are Mongols, born to fight with strength. Without that strength, we will crumble." The two factions stood at an impasse. The air was thick with tension, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. And then, as if the weight of centuries of tradition had finally caught up with him, Genghis Khan appeared from the shadows. His presence was as commanding as ever, but his expression was unreadable. "Enough," he said, his voice carrying across the camp. "This empire does not need to be divided. Mbappé, Baidar, you are both right. We are strong. But we are also changing. The world changes. And if we do not change with it, we will be left behind." The words hung in the air like a hammer strike. Mbappé and Baidar exchanged one final glance. The choice had been made. The Mongol Empire would move forward, not by abandoning its roots, but by embracing the future. The struggle for the soul of the empire had ended, but the war for its future was only beginning. The Mongol army had come a long way. Under Mbappé's leadership, they had changed the way they fought, speed, precision, and intelligence had become the core of their tactics. The empire was on the verge of greatness, and Mbappé stood at the heart of it, a symbol of the future. But the price of greatness was steep. The fractures in the empire, once subtle, had now become impossible to ignore. The uneasy peace that had followed the confrontation between Mbappé and the traditionalists held for only so long. Genghis Khan had brokered the truce, but the empire's unity remained fragile. Despite the emperor's words, the divisions persisted, and it became clear that the Mongol Empire was not as strong as it once seemed. Mbappé had thought that by winning the battle for the army's soul, he had secured his place as a leader, and that the future of the empire would be his to shape. But the weight of the crown was not so easily worn. The night was silent, but the air was thick with tension as Mbappé walked through the camp. He had heard rumors of betrayal, whispers that something wasn't right. But he had brushed them off. He was too focused on the next steps, on securing their position in the world. The war with the other kingdoms had been far from over, and the Mongol Empire had to move quickly to consolidate its power. What Mbappé didn't realize was that as he marched forward, he was walking straight into a trap. It happened under the cover of darkness, when the Mongol army was asleep. A single rider approached Mbappé's tent, an envoy of Genghis Khan himself. The man, whose face was hidden behind a heavy hood, delivered a simple message: "The emperor requires your presence." Mbappé, unaware of the danger, followed the rider through the darkened camp, his mind still preoccupied with the next battle. He arrived at the tent of Genghis Khan and entered without hesitation. But as the flap of the tent closed behind him, he realized too late that something was wrong. The air felt still, too still. Genghis Khan, standing with his back to him, turned slowly. His eyes, once filled with the fire of conquest, were now cold and distant. "You've done well, Kilian," Genghis Khan said, his voice carrying an eerie calm. "You have changed the Mongols, made them stronger. But you have also made a mistake." Mbappé frowned. The words, though soft, carried a weight that made his stomach tighten. "What do you mean, Khan?" Genghis Khan's lips curled into a twisted smile, and that's when Mbappé saw it, the betrayal. The Mongol emperor wasn't just testing his loyalty, he was ending it. Behind Genghis Khan, several of the senior generals, including Baidar, stood, their faces unreadable, their hands resting lightly on their weapons. Mbappé's heart sank as he realized the truth. This wasn't a meeting, it was a trap. And Genghis Khan had just turned on him. "You have become a threat, Kilian," Genghis Khan continued, his voice dripping with venom. "You are no longer a part of the Mongol vision. You have made the Mongols weak. You've made us think. That is not what we do." Before Mbappé could react, Baidar stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "You have stolen the soul of our people, Kilian. The Mongols are not meant to fight with strategy, they are meant to conquer with strength. And you've twisted them." Mbappé's mind raced, his hands instinctively reaching for his weapons. He had been blindsided, his trust betrayed by the very people he had fought beside. The emperor, the generals, all of them, they had turned on him. "I've led you to victory," Mbappé said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "And this is how you repay me? You have become a liability, Kilian," Genghis Khan said coldly. "You've taught us to fear. You've made us think about the future, when we should only think of domination." In that moment, Mbappé understood that the Mongols, as he knew them, were lost. The empire that had been so full of promise, so full of potential, was now a machine of tyranny and brute force. Genghis Khan, in his infinite pride, had chosen to preserve the Mongol legacy, even if it meant sacrificing the future. The blow came swift. Baidar's hand, which had been resting on his sword, now pulled it from its sheath with alarming speed. The traditionalists had won. The men who had once sworn loyalty to Mbappé were now turning against him. They moved in on him like wolves closing in on their prey. Mbappé's reflexes kicked in as he fought to defend himself, but it was hopeless. The numbers were too great. The other generals closed in, their weapons drawn, their faces cold with determination. The dream of a new Mongol empire, one built on speed, strategy, and precision, was slipping away. As the blade struck, Mbappé felt the world slow down around him. He stumbled, the weight of the betrayal heavy on his chest. His body was no longer his own, he was at the mercy of those who had once stood beside him. But in that final, fleeting moment, as he collapsed to the ground, Mbappé saw the truth. The Mongols had never truly changed. They were a people bound to their roots, roots that had been buried so deep in their tradition that no amount of speed or intelligence could ever uproot them. They were warriors of the past, not the future. When the sun rose the next morning, the camp was eerily quiet. Mbappé was gone, and the Mongol Empire was forever changed. The traditionalists had won, and Genghis Khan, now more resolute than ever, had restored the old ways of warfare. The empire would continue to expand, but it would be a pale imitation of the empire that Mbappé had tried to create. The soldiers who had once followed Mbappé, inspired by his vision, now marched in line with the rest of the Mongol army, subdued, their hopes crushed beneath the weight of their heritage. They would fight, they would conquer, but they would never fight for something greater than power. The Mongol dream of a new world, a world where speed and intelligence were just as important as strength, was over. Genghis Khan, standing tall above his army, spoke to them as they prepared for their next campaign. "We will never forget our roots," he said, his voice ringing out with power. "We are Mongols. We will conquer with strength. And we will never change." But for Mbappé, it was too late. The dream had died with him. As the Mongol Empire continued its relentless conquest, something stirred deep in the heart of the empire's enemies. Whispers began to spread of a new leader rising from the ashes of the old ways. A leader who had learned from Mbappé's vision, who understood that the future of war was in speed, strategy, and adaptability. A new empire, built from the lessons of the past and the promise of the future, was quietly forming. And though the Mongol Empire would continue its reign of terror for many years to come, the world had begun to change. And somewhere, out of sight, a new force was preparing to rise, one that would eventually challenge the might of the Mongols. Mbappé's legacy had not died with him. It had only just begun.